Hello and welcome, my friends. Grab a drink, get comfortable, and settle in for a little while. Tonight, we have a mix of messy, awkward, and very petty Reddit stories. We have a husband who faked a deadly allergy for years, a dream vacation with a very strange reason behind it, and an IT guy who decided to give his boss a little hardware problem. So, I hope you enjoy these as much as I did. Our first story is from r/AmItheAsshole subreddit, and the title is Am I the A-hole for not telling my girlfriend's parents that I speak their language for almost 3 years because they never asked? The narrator's girlfriend came from a Russian-speaking family. Her parents were native Russian speakers, although they also spoke fluent German, which was the language everyone normally used around him. Because of that, communication had never been a problem. They all understood one another perfectly well, and there had never been any obvious reason to discuss which other languages he knew. What the parents didn't know was that the narrator also understood Russian. His great-grandfather had learned the language while being held as a prisoner of war in Siberia, and later passed some of it down through the family. The narrator eventually took a Russian course himself. After that, he continued listening to and watching Russian content from time to time, until he reached what he describes as a decent conversational level. He wasn't completely fluent, but he could comfortably understand everyday conversations and respond when necessary. His girlfriend had always known that he spoke some Russian. She knew about his family connection to the language, although she didn't speak it herself. Her parents also knew the story about his great-grandfather, but apparently it had never occurred to them that the narrator might have learned Russian too. He didn't deliberately hide it from them. The subject simply never came up, and they never asked. Every now and then, the parents exchanged a few short comments in Russian while he was nearby. But according to the narrator, they never discussed anything especially personal or sensitive. There were no family secrets, no insults directed at him, and nothing that would have caused a serious problem if he understood it. Most of the time, everyone continued speaking German, so whenever he overheard those occasional Russian comments, he understood them, but didn't think there was any reason to interrupt and announce it. Then, one evening, a family friend came to visit. He was also Russian, and everyone spent the evening talking, eating, and joking around together. At some point, the older guests began teasing the narrator's generation. It was mostly lighthearted banter. The usual jokes about younger people being softer, less capable, and not nearly as tough as previous generations. The family friend became especially confident. Speaking in Russian, he started talking about how much stronger his generation supposedly was, and how people the narrator's age could never compete with them. The narrator understood every word, and because the entire conversation had been playful up to that point, he decided to join in. In the same joking tone, the narrator looked at him and replied in Russian, "Well then, I hope you're ready to put your money where your mouth is." The entire room went silent. His girlfriend's parents stared at him. The family friend stared at him. Nobody seemed to care about the joke anymore, because they had all just realized that he understood Russian. Yeah, that might be the most dramatic possible way to reveal that information. After almost 3 years of saying nothing, one Russian comeback was all it took. Later, his girlfriend explained that her parents were genuinely disturbed. They believed he had kept something significant from them, and were especially uncomfortable knowing that he had understood their occasional Russian conversations all along. They also began describing him as fluent, although the narrator insists that his Russian really wasn't that advanced. Still, from their perspective, he had quietly listened for almost 3 years without ever telling them that he understood. The narrator didn't understand why everyone suddenly considered it such a major secret. Nobody had ever asked whether he spoke Russian. The language had never become a serious topic of conversation, and his girlfriend had known from the beginning. He also points out that the parents already knew about his great-grandfather learning Russian in Siberia. To him, it simply felt like one of those random personal facts that never naturally came up. He also rejected the idea that he had been secretly eavesdropping. The parents had spoken Russian openly while he was sitting in the same room. They hadn't shared private information, and if they had said anything important or directly relevant to him, he believes he would have responded. But most of their comments were brief and unimportant, so he had simply allowed the conversations to continue. His girlfriend could understand why both sides felt the way they did. She knew that he hadn't intentionally created some elaborate deception. At the same time, she could understand why her parents felt embarrassed after suddenly discovering that their supposedly private Russian comments had never actually been private. Even so, she also thought the entire argument had become unnecessarily dramatic and wished everyone would simply move past it. The narrator was left wondering whether he had actually done something wrong. Was he obligated to announce every language he understood, even though nobody had asked? Or had the parents simply made an assumption about him and then become upset when that assumption turned out to be wrong? So, was he the a-hole? Okay, I don't think this guy deliberately tricked anyone. His girlfriend knew the entire time. The parents never asked. And apparently, nobody ever said anything genuinely private or damaging around him. So calling it some enormous secret feels a little dramatic to me. But almost 3 years is also a long time. If I regularly heard people switching into another language around me, I think I'd eventually mention, hey, just so you know, I understand some of that. Not because anyone is entitled to a list of every language you speak, but because people naturally use language as a kind of social boundary. They probably thought those tiny conversations were only between them. Oh, wow, that sunrise actually looks really nice from here. Okay, sorry. But anyways, back to what I was saying. Revealing it by suddenly answering a rude joke in Russian? Yeah, very funny from the outside. Probably horrifying when you're one of the people sitting at that table and immediately trying to remember everything you've said over the last 3 years. I can just imagine the silence while all of them mentally replay every Russian conversation they ever had around him. I also think it matters that his girlfriend already knew. If she believed this was something her parents really needed to know, she could have casually mentioned it at some point too. So I don't think all the responsibility belongs to him. To me, this feels less like someone being the villain and more like one very avoidable, very awkward misunderstanding. He probably should have brought it up sooner, but the parents treating it like a major betrayal seems like a bit much. But okay. Our next story is a little more lighthearted. A woman thought she had successfully stolen the last prime rib right out from under someone, only for the employee to disappear into the back and come out with something much, much better. This one is from r/pettyrevenge subreddit and it is called I Insist You Take the Last One. The narrator and her husband were grocery shopping for an upcoming vacation. They only take this particular trip once a year, so they like to spoil themselves a little while they're there. Prime rib one night, seafood another night, baby back ribs. Basically, good food is part of the vacation. And luckily for them, their local grocery store has a really good meat department. Around major holidays, the store sometimes puts its more expensive cuts of meat on sale. They had missed the previous prime rib sale around the 4th of July, but this time they got lucky. Prime rib was marked down by $6 per pound, which, yeah, for prime rib, that's a pretty nice discount. While her husband looked at the seafood, the narrator walked over toward the meat counter. An employee was already helping another woman, and as he finished wrapping her order, the narrator noticed something. There was only one prime rib left. It wasn't perfect. It hadn't been trimmed particularly well, and it barely had any of the cap on it, which is usually one of the best parts. But with that sale price, she was still happy to take it. She mentioned to her husband that it looked like this was the last one, and apparently the woman standing at the counter heard her. The employee finished helping that customer, handed over her package, and turned toward the narrator. But before she could order, the other woman suddenly spoke up. "Excuse me." She pointed directly at the prime rib. "Can you wrap that up for me as well?" The narrator just looked at her and asked, "Seriously?" And the woman responded, "I was here first." Then she gave the narrator what she describes as this sarcastic little grimace. Oh, okay, so she definitely heard her say it was the last one? Got it? The narrator decided it wasn't worth arguing. She walked back over to her husband and told him they would need a plan B for dinner. Meanwhile, the other woman grabbed her prime rib and walked away with a huge grin on her face. The narrator says she and her husband were both mildly annoyed, but that was going to be the end of it. No confrontation, no argument. They were just going to buy something else and move on. Then the employee from the meat counter walked over to them, and he quietly said, "She never asked before you did." Then he added, "I actually have one more prime rib in the back. Would you like to see it?" Oh, here we go. This is already getting better. The narrator didn't even need to see it. She immediately told him she would take it. A few minutes later, the employee returned from the back, carrying a prime rib that was noticeably nicer than the one she had just lost. This one was beautifully trimmed. It was about a pound larger. And unlike the first one, it had a huge, beautiful cap on it. Basically, the woman who rushed to take the last prime rib had accidentally left the narrator with the better one. And the employee wasn't finished because the replacement was larger than the original piece she had planned to buy. The employee offered her another $1 off per pound on top of the sale price she was already getting. So somehow, after losing the last prime rib, she walked away with a bigger, better cut for an even better price. Yep, I would be absolutely delighted at this point, but somehow the story still wasn't over. When they reached the checkout lanes, the narrator and her husband ended up directly ahead of the woman from the meat counter, the same woman who had walked away grinning with her stolen prize. The narrator's husband unloaded every other item from their cart first. He deliberately saved the prime rib until the very end. Then he picked up this huge, perfectly trimmed roast and placed it right where the other woman could see it. And he said, "They did just so happen to have one really nice one in the back. Enjoy yours." No, that is so petty. I love it. Then the cashier scanned the meat, completely unaware of the little prime rib rivalry happening beside her. She looked at it and said, "Oh, I know where I'm coming for dinner." And then she noticed the price. "Nice, they gave you a discount. Lucky you." The narrator's husband just stood there, grinning at the other woman. She did not grin back. All right, I need to admit, that was incredibly satisfying. And the best part is that they barely even did anything. They didn't argue with her. They didn't try to take the meat back. They were literally willing to accept defeat and find something else for dinner. She created the entire petty revenge moment herself by hearing, "That's the last one," and immediately deciding, "Yep, I need that too." Also, I really like the employee in this story. He clearly knew exactly what had happened, and instead of making a scene, he just quietly went, "Actually, I have something better in the back," and then gave them another discount on top of it. That man understood the assignment. The husband, though, waiting until everything else was out of the cart before dramatically placing the prime rib down right in front of her? Yeah, that was absolutely intentional. And then the cashier, unknowingly announcing that they got an extra discount, was just perfect timing. It's such a tiny, completely harmless revenge story. But those are sometimes the most satisfying ones. Nobody's life was ruined. Nobody had a huge confrontation. One person just tried to be a little smug and accidentally helped someone else get a much better dinner. Yep, I'd call that a win. But anyways, let's move on to our next story, which starts with what sounds like a really bizarre lie about food. But then we get an update almost 4 years later, and somehow the fake allergy ends up being the least concerning part. This story is called "My Husband Lied About Being Deathly Allergic to a Certain Food," plus a 4-year update. When the narrator first started dating her husband, he told her that he had a severe, potentially fatal allergy to a certain food. So naturally, she took it seriously. They avoided restaurants where exposure might be a problem. He was extremely careful whenever they ate out. And when she cooked for him for the first time, she removed that food from her apartment and thoroughly cleaned the kitchen. He even showed her his EpiPen and explained how she should use it if he ever had a reaction. When they eventually moved in together, they made sure there was always an EpiPen nearby. One stayed in the house, one in the car, and the narrator even carried another one in her purse. Her family knew about the allergy too, so whenever they had family gatherings, everyone made sure the food was safe for him. For years, she genuinely believed that one mistake could put her husband's life in danger. And at this point, of course she believed him. Why wouldn't you? Then, one weekend, they went to the narrator's brother's birthday dinner. Her sister-in-law had prepared the meal, and she was already very careful about allergies because one of her own children had a real allergy to something different. So after dinner, she packed leftovers into 2 separate containers. They even had different colored lids, specifically so nobody would mix them up. Later, the narrator's husband accidentally grabbed the wrong container and ate the leftovers that supposedly contained the food he was deathly allergic to. The narrator panicked. So did her sister-in-law. They genuinely believed they might have just watched him eat something that could kill him. Because, according to her husband, his allergy was so severe that even food prepared with utensils that had touched the allergen could cause a fatal reaction. But then nothing happened. No reaction. No breathing problems. No EpiPen. Nothing. And that was when the truth finally came out. Oh no, I already know I'm not going to like this explanation. Her husband admitted that he had never been allergic to the food at all. He simply didn't like it. When he went to university, he apparently started telling people he was allergic because he thought that sounded better than admitting he was a picky eater. And then he just kept the lie going for years. This wasn't something he had only told his wife. His friends believed it. His family believed it. Even the narrator's family had been planning meals around this supposedly life-threatening allergy. His mother had passed away before the narrator met him. His parents had been divorced, and he didn't see his father very often because his dad lived in another province, so there apparently wasn't anyone close enough to immediately expose the lie. The narrator wasn't angry because her husband disliked a particular food. She was furious because for years he had allowed her to believe that a tiny mistake could kill him. She had carried an EpiPen everywhere. She had cleaned kitchens around his supposed allergy. Her family had changed what they cooked. And when he ate the wrong leftovers, she genuinely thought her husband might die in front of her, only to discover that none of it had ever been real. Yeah, that's the part that would get me too. Not, you don't like this food. Who cares? It's letting someone repeatedly experience real fear for your safety over something you completely made up. Nearly 4 years later, the narrator returned with an update. She was now 36, her husband was 37, and she admitted that she had almost completely forgotten she had ever written the original post. But unfortunately, the fake allergy had not been the end of the story. After the leftover incident, her husband apologized. He admitted that lying about the allergy had been wrong and apologized for making her believe he was in danger. For a while, she tried to move past it. It still bothered her that she had spent years carrying an EpiPen for an allergy that didn't exist, but she thought maybe this was one incredibly stupid lie that had simply gotten out of control. Except, it wasn't the only lie. Eventually, she discovered that her husband had also lied about receiving an athletic scholarship to university. He had always claimed that he lost the scholarship after getting injured. In reality, he had never been recruited for sport at all. He applied to university normally and took out student loans like plenty of other people. Okay, so now we have a pattern. Then there was the story about spending an entire season working in the Arctic before they met. That never happened either. He had apparently invented the whole thing. And then there was an old car he proudly claimed to have restored himself. Except he had bought the car already restored. The narrator says there were countless other examples. Some were big, some were small, but taken together, they completely changed the problem. This was no longer one ridiculous lie about food that had gone on for too long. Her husband seemed to have built entire pieces of his identity out of stories that simply weren't true. According to her husband, he lies because it makes him feel better about himself. He seems to embellish his life whenever reality doesn't feel impressive enough. He also connects some of it to his childhood, particularly the fact that his father wasn't very involved while he was growing up. But regardless of where the behavior came from, his wife was now struggling to figure out what parts of the man she married she could actually trust. The couple is now in marriage counseling for about a year and a half after the original allergy incident. Things had seemed relatively normal. Then more lies began surfacing, and the narrator says she has been floundering ever since. Her friends and family believe she should leave, but the couple has a 5-year-old son, and because both of them grew up with divorced parents, she's been trying to see whether the marriage can still be repaired for their child's sake. She doesn't pretend to have an answer. She isn't saying the counseling has fixed everything, and she isn't saying she has decided to leave. She simply says that right now, she's struggling. Almost 4 years after discovering that the deadly allergy was fake, she's still trying to understand how much of her marriage was built around things that weren't true. Okay. Wow. The update completely changes this story for me. At first, I could almost imagine someone telling one stupid lie in college because they were embarrassed about being picky, and then getting trapped in it because admitting the truth became more embarrassing every year. Still terrible, especially once your wife is literally carrying an EpiPen around for you, but I could at least understand how one lie snowballs. But the scholarship, the Arctic, restoring the car, those aren't connected to the allergy at all. That's not one lie getting out of control anymore. And I think that would be the hardest part for me. Once you find out someone has lied about that many completely unnecessary things, how do you know when you've finally found all of them? Every random story they've ever told you suddenly becomes something you have to mentally fact check. That sounds exhausting. Also, pretending to have a deadly allergy is such an awful thing to lie about, because you're not just changing what you eat. Everyone around you starts managing the imaginary danger too. His wife carried medication for him. His family changed meals for him. His sister-in-law was worrying about cross-contamination, and then those two women thought they had accidentally fed him something that might kill him. That panic was completely real, even if the allergy wasn't. And I don't know, I feel bad for her because the update doesn't really have that satisfying Reddit ending where everything gets exposed and suddenly life is perfect. She's just still in it, trying counseling, trying to work out what's best for her son, and probably wondering what she can believe. I hope the counseling helps them figure out what comes next, whatever that ends up looking like. But at this point, the food allergy feels like a symptom of a much bigger trust problem, and that is a much harder thing to fix than just admitting you don't like a particular food. So yeah, let's move on to our next story, which thankfully is a little lighter. It involves a cat feeder, a terrified neighbor, and one extremely unfortunate voice recording. This story is called "Today I Messed Up by Giving My Neighbor a Cat Feeder That Still Had My Voice Recorded on It." The narrator used to have an automatic feeder for their cat, but after changing the cat's food, the feeder stopped being useful, so they cleaned it, put it inside a kitchen cabinet, and completely forgot about it. It stayed there for around 6 months. Then one day, a woman in the narrator's apartment building mentioned that she had recently adopted a cat. The narrator remembered the unused feeder sitting in the cabinet and offered it to her. Perfect. She gets a free automatic feeder. The narrator finally gets rid of something they aren't using. Everybody wins. Except the narrator had forgotten one tiny detail. At some point in the past, they had programmed a custom voice message into the feeder. Every morning at exactly 6 o'clock, it would announce breakfast using the narrator's own voice. And the message said, "Wake up, you unemployed little goblin. Your government assistance has arrived." Oh my God. Okay, that is an incredible thing to say to a cat. Slight problem when the person hearing it doesn't know it's coming from a cat feeder. The first morning after taking the feeder home, the neighbor heard an unfamiliar voice inside her apartment. She had a baby monitor, so naturally, her first thought was that someone must have been speaking through it, which honestly would be terrifying enough by itself. But eventually, the voice stopped, and she apparently couldn't figure out where it had come from. Then 6 o'clock came around again the next morning. The same voice returned. This time, the neighbor unplugged the baby monitor, and the voice kept talking. Nope. No, because at that point, I'm assuming my apartment is haunted. Now, genuinely frightened, she started checking the rooms of her apartment. because from her perspective, she had unplugged the obvious source of the mysterious voice, and somebody was still apparently inside her home, calling something an unemployed little goblin. She had no idea that the narrator's voice was simply announcing breakfast to her cat. The cat, meanwhile, was probably having a fantastic morning. Eventually, at exactly 6 in the morning, the neighbor happened to be standing near the automatic feeder. The message played again, and she finally realized where the mysterious voice had been coming from. So the good news was, nobody had broken into her apartment. The bad news was, she now knew exactly whose voice had been haunting her every morning. Later, she knocked on the narrator's door. She was holding the feeder and asked why the narrator's voice had been insulting her cat every morning before sunrise. That was the moment the narrator remembered the recording. I would actually want the floor to open up and swallow me. How do you even begin explaining that? The narrator immediately deleted the message from the feeder. So the neighbor's apartment is no longer being haunted every morning at 6. Her cat can now eat breakfast without being personally attacked first. Problem solved. The narrator immediately deleted the message from the feeder. So the neighbor's apartment is no longer being haunted every morning at 6. Her cat can now eat breakfast without being personally attacked first. Problem solved. Unfortunately, they still live in the same building, so now the narrator has to occasionally meet this woman in the elevator, knowing that she spent multiple mornings wandering around her apartment looking for them, all because they forgot that a cat feeder still contained a recording of their voice. Okay, I love this one, because nobody actually did anything wrong. The narrator genuinely forgot the recording existed, and the poor neighbor had absolutely no reason to suspect that her new cat feeder was secretly insulting her cat at 6 in the morning. But imagine the second morning. You hear the mystery voice again, you unplug the baby monitor, and it keeps going. Yep, I'm leaving. The cat can have the apartment. Also, wake up, you unemployed little goblin. Your government assistance has arrived. Might be one of the funniest possible breakfast announcements for a cat. Completely reasonable when you know the context. Absolutely horrifying when it suddenly starts playing somewhere inside your home at 6 in the morning. I think the worst part would honestly be the elevator rides afterwards, because what are you supposed to say? Sorry you spent 2 mornings searching your apartment for me. Hope the cat likes the feeder. Yeah. I don't think I'd ever recover from that interaction. But anyways, let's move on to our next story. This one is called My Boyfriend and His Family Are Going on My Dream Vacation, and I don't know how to deal with my jealousy. The narrator had dreamed about visiting Japan for years. She started learning Japanese back in elementary school, became fascinated with the culture, cooked Japanese food, read books in Japanese, and continued learning about the country as she got older. By the time she was finishing college, Japan wasn't just some random vacation destination to her. It was the place she had wanted to visit for most of her life. During her junior year of college, she had actually been offered the chance to study abroad in Japan. She even received a small scholarship, but because of the requirements of her degree program, she ultimately couldn't make it work, so the opportunity disappeared, and she was understandably pretty disappointed about it. She was graduating soon and would have loved to spend the summer traveling through Japan, but financially, it simply wasn't realistic. She didn't have the kind of money required for a big international vacation. Her boyfriend of 3 years, Jack, knew all of this, and so did his parents. Then one day, Jack's parents surprised her with some news. They were going to Japan that summer. Jack himself apparently hadn't even known about the trip until his parents mentioned it in front of her. And strangely enough, Jack had never shown much interest in visiting Japan at all. But the trip itself wasn't really what bothered her most. What started getting to her was how often Jack's parents talked about it around her. Every new booking, every destination, every tour, every little change to the itinerary. They made a point of telling her about it. Maybe they thought she would find it interesting because she loved Japan so much. But instead, every new detail felt like another reminder that they were about to experience something she had wanted for years and couldn't afford herself. And just to be clear, she knew she wasn't invited. Jack's parents had made it clear that this was a family vacation. She wasn't expecting them to pay for her trip, and she understood that they were allowed to travel wherever they wanted. She just couldn't understand why they kept enthusiastically discussing every detail with her. There was one detail that made the situation feel even stranger. Jack's parents had hired a local translator to travel with them. The narrator spoke Japanese herself and says she was fluent enough that translating for them would not have been a problem. So part of her couldn't help thinking, if they wanted someone who knew the language and understood the culture, why were they paying a stranger instead of simply inviting her? Okay, that part would confuse me too. Not because they owe her a vacation. They absolutely don't. But knowing how much she loves Japan and then hiring a translator while constantly telling her about the trip is a little weird. Jack's family was also extremely wealthy. During the 3 years she had known them, they had taken expensive family vacations to places like the Bahamas, New York, England, France, and the Grand Canyon. Meanwhile, the narrator had barely traveled outside her own state. Again, she knew their money was theirs, but of all the places they could have chosen, Japan happened to be the one destination she had talked about endlessly for years, and that left her feeling guilty. She knew jealousy wasn't exactly a flattering emotion, and she didn't want to act entitled to somebody else's vacation, so she asked Reddit whether she should simply deal with those feelings privately, or whether it would be reasonable to ask Jack and his parents to stop constantly talking about the trip around her. One commenter suggested another possibility. Maybe Jack's parents actually wanted her to come, but understandably didn't want to pay for her. Perhaps all the constant discussion was their awkward way of opening the door for her to ask whether she could join them. The narrator considered that too. There was one problem with that explanation. Jack's parents already knew that she couldn't afford the trip. She had talked openly about wanting to visit Japan during previous summers and about not having the money. She had even mentioned that she couldn't afford to go that particular summer before they announced their vacation. Still, she wondered whether maybe they were trying to hint at something. The following week, she returned with an update. The night after writing the original post, she sat down with Jack and explained how she was feeling. She told him that she knew his parents probably meant well, but hearing every detail of their Japan trip was making her more sad than excited. At first, Jack didn't really understand. Then she reminded him about the study abroad opportunity she had lost and how disappointed she had been when she realized she couldn't go. That helped him understand the situation a little better. Jack eventually admitted that his parents were being somewhat insensitive, constantly gushing about a vacation to someone who desperately wanted to go but couldn't. Probably wasn't the nicest thing to do. The narrator asked whether Jack could gently talk to his parents about it. He refused. He said that if she wanted the situation resolved, she would have to speak to them herself. So eventually she decided to do exactly that. She visited Jack's parents privately rather than bringing it up during one of their regular dinners. And she tried very hard not to accuse them of anything. She told them that she appreciated their excitement and understood that they were simply planning their vacation, but explained that Japan was still an emotional subject for her. She talked about how much she had wanted to study there, how long she had dreamed about visiting, and how difficult it was hearing about the trip over and over again. She deliberately focused the conversation on her own feelings. She even admitted that her jealousy was something she needed to work on. Her goal was basically to say, I know you're not doing anything wrong by going. I'm just asking you to be a little sensitive about how much we discuss it. She hoped that approaching it this way would prevent them from feeling attacked. It did not. When she finished explaining herself, Jack's parents sat there in complete silence. Finally, his mother looked at her and said coldly, I'm sorry you're offended. The narrator tried to keep the conversation going, but every response became shorter and colder. Jack's father eventually got up and walked out of the room entirely. Oof, okay, that response feels way more hostile than the conversation she described having with them. When she told Jack what happened, she expected him to be confused by his parents' reaction. And initially, he was. But then something changed. Jack suddenly decided that the narrator had been unreasonable from the beginning. He told her she should have known his parents would take the conversation badly, and claimed that bringing it up to them had been rude, which was particularly confusing because he had been the one who refused to speak to them and told her to handle it herself. Yeah, I don't love that. You can't tell someone, talk to them yourself, and then blame them for doing exactly that. Jack's family normally had dinner together every Wednesday, but that week, His parents never contacted her. So the narrator eventually called Jack's mother herself and asked whether their usual dinner was still happening. His mother simply replied, "Sorry, that's not going to work," and ended the conversation. At this point, the narrator had no idea what was happening. Jack's parents were ignoring her. Jack had stopped supporting her, and what had begun as a relatively small conversation about jealousy had somehow turned into a major conflict with the entire family. She began reconsidering her relationship with all three of them. Then, a couple of hours after the update was posted, Jack's mother called her again. And this is where the entire story changes. According to Jack's mother, they had been talking about the Japan trip around her constantly on purpose. They knew she wanted to visit, they knew she couldn't afford it, and they wanted her to become jealous. Wait, what? Jack's mother claimed that they had been hoping the narrator would eventually break down and ask them to pay for her trip. They wanted her to beg them to let her come along, and apparently that was the entire point. Because if she asked them for the money, they planned to use it as proof to Jack that his girlfriend came from a lower social class. They wanted to demonstrate that she was financially beneath their family and therefore wasn't a suitable partner for their son. The Japan vacation had essentially been bait. Oh my God, that is so much worse than I expected. And then somehow making the conversation even stranger. Jack's mother essentially broke up with the narrator on her son's behalf. She made it clear that she didn't believe the narrator belonged with their family, and apparently expected that to be the end of it. The narrator was stunned. At that point, she didn't particularly care whether every word Jack's mother said was true. Maybe the woman was telling the truth. Maybe she was trying to hurt her because she had been offended by the earlier conversation. Either way, the narrator was done. She no longer wanted anything to do with Jack or his parents. After 3 years together, she described the entire situation as an enormous waste of time and wanted nothing more to do with such classist, manipulative people. Okay. I need to say I was not expecting that ending. For most of this story, I was trying to give his parents the benefit of the doubt. Like, maybe they genuinely thought she enjoyed hearing about Japan because she loved the country. Insensitive? Sure. But deliberately cruel? I wasn't there yet. And then his mother basically goes, "Nope, actually we were trying to make you jealous because we wanted you to beg us for money." What kind of weird social experiment is that? And their plan doesn't even make sense to me. They already knew she couldn't afford the vacation. Being unable to casually pay for an international trip immediately after college doesn't exactly reveal some shocking character flaw. That describes a lot of people. They wanted to put her in a situation where she needed help, and then judge her for needing the help they intentionally tried to make her ask for. That's incredibly manipulative, and Jack really bothers me here too, because at first he actually agreed that his parents were being insensitive. Then he refused to speak to them himself, told his girlfriend she had to handle it, and once his parents got angry, suddenly she was the unreasonable one. Nope. You don't get to send your partner into a difficult conversation alone and then switch sides the second your parents don't like the outcome. And I think it says a lot that she never actually did what the parents were supposedly waiting for. She didn't beg for an invitation. She didn't ask them to pay. She didn't demand they change their vacation. She literally just asked them to stop describing every detail to her because it was making her sad. So, yeah, I think losing the boyfriend probably hurt a lot more than missing Japan ever did. 3 years is a long relationship to suddenly look back on differently, but if that phone call was even remotely accurate, I think getting away from this family was probably the better trip in the long run. Wow. Okay, but anyways, let's leave that family in Japan and move on to our next story. It comes from the r/pettyrevenge subreddit, and it's called "My Boss Wanted Me to Falsify Invoices, so I gave him a hardware problem for my last 2 weeks." The narrator worked as a system administrator for a company and also had domain administrator access. Basically, that meant he had a lot of control over employee accounts, computers, and things like startup scripts, And unfortunately, one of the company directors eventually decided that this access could be useful for something far less innocent. The director asked him to alter invoices after they had already been generated. The idea was to make clients pay for work that had never actually been performed, which would conveniently make the director's department look more profitable. And apparently, the director had some kind of bonus tied to those numbers. He knew the narrator was one of only 2 people in the company with access to Photoshop, and apparently assumed that would make him willing to help. It did not. Yeah, that's not exactly the kind of extra responsibility you want at work. The narrator refused. He reported the request to his own boss, but nothing happened. So instead of sticking around and hoping things improved, he handed in his notice. A few weeks later, he entered his final 2 weeks with the company, and somehow, the director still hadn't gotten the message. He approached the narrator again and asked him to alter another batch of invoices. This time, he claimed that accounting had supposedly approved it. The narrator still refused, but since he was leaving anyway, he decided the director could experience one small IT mystery before he went. Oh no, I can already tell where this is going. The narrator created a very simple batch script. Whenever the director logged into his computer, the script would wait somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes, and then randomly reboot the machine. He quietly added it to the director's startup profile through Active Directory, and because that department had already been dealing with hardware problems for almost a year, the director immediately assumed his computer was simply broken. The computer started rebooting at completely unpredictable moments. 5 minutes after startup, maybe 10, then another random reboot later. After it happened around 5 times, the director finally called the narrator into his office and asked him to fix it. The director left for lunch, so the narrator sat down at the computer and began what he described as his extremely advanced troubleshooting process. He stared at the screen, reached into a jar of Skittles sitting on the director's desk, and ate them for about 5 minutes. Okay, that might be my favorite IT troubleshooting method I've heard so far. After finishing his investigation, the narrator simply told the director, "I'll keep an eye on it," and that was apparently enough. The director never figured out what was actually causing the reboots. The funniest part was that even the narrator's own IT manager apparently didn't understand startup scripts particularly well. So all the narrator had to do was give the file a boring, believable name, something like samsupdates.bat, and nobody questioned it. Nothing suspicious here, just another very normal update file. Eventually, the narrator finished his notice period and left the company. And you would think that would finally be the end of his relationship with the director. Nope. About a week later, the former director started contacting him again. He demanded that the narrator finish a project he had supposedly committed to before leaving, except he apparently expected him to do it without being paid. The narrator ignored the messages, blocked his number, and moved on. As for the reboot script, the narrator says perpetual reboot insanity.bat lives on in legend. And honestly, that is an incredible name for it. By the way, I really like how peaceful this place looks like during sunrise. But anyways, this is definitely one of those revenge stories that I would never recommend actually recreating. But as a story from the outside, the image of this director demanding fake invoices and then spending his last 2 weeks wondering why his computer randomly hates him is pretty funny. What also gets me is that the narrator had already refused once, reported him, and literally decided to leave the company. And the director still came back and asked again. Like, at some point, you have to realize this person is not going to help you commit fraud. But the Skittles are absolutely my favorite part. Imagine calling IT because your computer keeps rebooting. And the guy just sits there eating your candy for 5 minutes before going, I'll keep an eye on it. That is so unserious. And then asking him to come back and finish unpaid work after he'd already left? Yeah, blocking that number sounds like the healthiest part of this entire story. Very petty, very ridiculous, but definitely entertaining. All right, this next story caused a surprisingly big argument in the comments. It comes from the Am I the A-hole subreddit, and it's called Am I the a-hole for not walking the dog because my girlfriend had a migraine? The narrator is 19 and his girlfriend is also 19. She was spending the evening at his house, and the two of them were just sitting in his room watching TV. After a while, though, his girlfriend started developing a migraine. She told him it felt worse than the ones she normally gets, and the medication she takes for them also makes her pretty drowsy. Eventually, she lay down against him with her head resting on his chest. And after a little while, she fell asleep. The narrator didn't want to move her because she had finally gotten comfortable and seemed to be resting through some of the pain. Oh, okay, I can already see why he didn't want to move. Once someone finally gets comfortable when they're feeling awful, you kind of don't want to ruin it. A little later, his mom texted him asking whether he could help with the dogs. The family has 2 dogs, and one of them is much larger and tends to pull pretty hard whenever he gets excited. Normally, either the narrator or his dad walks that dog, depending on who's available, but his dad was currently in the middle of cooking dinner. His mom then sent a message in the family group chat. She asked whether he could take the bigger dog while she walked the other one. The narrator replied that he couldn't do it right then because his girlfriend had a migraine and was asleep on top of him. His mom responded that his girlfriend could sit by herself for a little while and told him he was being ridiculous. Then his dad joined in. He pointed out that walking the dog would only take around 20 minutes and said the girlfriend was being a baby about the whole thing. Yeah, calling somebody a baby while they're in pain probably isn't helping this conversation. The narrator told them that he understood the dog still needed to be walked. He just didn't want to wake his girlfriend up and physically move her when she had finally managed to fall asleep. So he suggested that his dad take the dog once dinner was finished, and in exchange, the narrator would handle the dishes afterward. His dad didn't like that answer either. He told him he was being extremely immature. The narrator repeated that his girlfriend was in pain and that he simply didn't want to get up while she was resting on him. He also offered again to make up for it by doing the dishes later. Eventually, both parents just replied with, "Okay," and they walked the dogs themselves. But apparently, that wasn't actually the end of it. The next day, his dad was still annoyed. The two of them argued about what had happened, and his dad said it was ridiculous that he wouldn't get up for 20 minutes just because his girlfriend was lying on him. Before the narrator could even fully respond, his 14-year-old sister added her opinion too. She said the girlfriend sounded manipulative. The narrator completely disagreed. From his perspective, his girlfriend hadn't asked him to stay there. She wasn't demanding anything. She was sick, had fallen asleep, and he personally decided that he wanted to stay with her. And yeah, that distinction actually matters to me. She wasn't saying, "You're not allowed to get up." He was the one choosing not to move her. The narrator told his family that he simply wanted to stay beside her because she was in pain, and accused them of making the whole situation unnecessarily dramatic. His dad responded that the issue wasn't really about the migraine anymore. To him, the problem was that his son had skipped helping the family over what he described as a whiny girl. That comment pushed the narrator over the edge. He told his dad to screw off and left. Afterward, his mom told him that he had been incredibly rude and needed to apologize. And the narrator admitted that he did feel bad about the way he reacted, but he still believed his family had turned a fairly small situation into a much bigger conflict than it needed to be. The comments were pretty divided. Although a lot of people sided with the narrator, several people pointed out that his girlfriend had finally fallen asleep while dealing with a bad migraine, and that waking her simply to prove he was willing to help seemed unnecessary. One commenter even joked that the internet already agrees you're legally not allowed to move if a cat falls asleep on you. So surely a sick girlfriend deserves at least the same privilege. Okay. That comment made me laugh. Apparently, we have established the official Reddit sleeping on you hierarchy now. But other commenters thought the narrator was missing the larger point. They argued that the dog still needed exercise, and that having a pet means someone has to be available to take responsibility for it. One person also questioned why the family had a large dog that not everyone seemed comfortable walking without a clear backup plan whenever the usual person wasn't available. So for those commenters, the girlfriend wasn't really the problem. The issue was the family's planning around the dog. I actually think there are two separate issues here. On the girlfriend side, I don't really think she did anything wrong. She had a migraine, took her medication, fell asleep, and apparently didn't even ask him to stay there. So calling her manipulative feels really unfair to me. As for him, I can understand both sides a little more. Yes, it was only 20 minutes. And obviously the dog still needs to be taken care of. But he also offered another solution. His dad was already cooking, so he suggested his dad walk the dog afterward, and he would take over the dishes. That doesn't sound like someone refusing to help entirely. It sounds like he was trying to swap responsibilities for one evening. And I think the part that makes me lean toward him is how quickly everyone started insulting his girlfriend, calling her a baby, then manipulative, then a whiny girl when she seemingly wasn't even involved in the argument. That feels unnecessary. Now, telling his dad to screw off obviously didn't improve anything. He probably could apologize for that part without admitting that he was wrong for wanting to stay with his girlfriend. Those two things can both be true. And maybe I'm soft, but if somebody I care about finally falls asleep while they're in pain with their head on my chest, yeah, I probably wouldn't be rushing to move either, especially if there was another perfectly workable way to get everything done. So I'm leaning not the a-hole here, but apparently Reddit had quite a lot to say about this one. Okay, now I think we need something a little lighter. This next story involves a father, his son, and one very unfortunately named Cinema Seat. It's called Today I Messed Up by Using the Love Seat. The narrator convinced his dad to go see the Odyssey with him at the cinema. He was expecting a pretty normal father-son bonding day, but things started going wrong almost immediately. They arrived at the theater and realized the screening was nearly sold out. The narrator hadn't booked their seats online because it was the first showing of the day, and he assumed it wouldn't be particularly busy. He was very wrong. There were very few seats left, and father and son basically had two choices. They could pick two normal seats that were still available, but they wouldn't be sitting together. Or they could take what the theater called a love seat, which was basically two seats joined together so couples could sit as close to each other as possible. Oh no, I already know he's going to overthink this. The narrator was immediately worried that the whole thing would look strange. His dad could not have cared less. He told his son that if he was worried about what random strangers might think, he should probably stop worrying because nobody was going to pay any attention to them anyway, so the dad chose the love seat. They started awkwardly making their way down a crowded row, repeatedly saying, "Excuse me," and "sorry," as people moved their legs to let them through. The dad was leading the way and eventually stopped beside a young woman sitting near one of the available seats. He asked her whether the empty place beside her was the couple's seat they were looking for. She looked confused for a second, then nodded. And that's when the dad turned around in the middle of this crowded theater and announced to his son, "Found the love seat." The narrator says he was basically trying to hide his face behind his popcorn at this point. Oh my god. Dads have absolutely no fear. The louder you desperately need them to be quiet, the louder they become. But apparently, announcing the love seat wasn't enough. The dad thanked the woman for helping, and then specifically introduced the narrator as his son, which honestly would have been a perfectly reasonable way to make the situation less awkward if he had stopped there, but he did not stop there. Instead, the dad decided to explain to this complete stranger that his son had been worried people might think the two of them were together. The woman looked a little caught off guard, but politely played along with the conversation. And then Dad decided there was one particular word his son had used earlier that she absolutely needed to hear. He kept encouraging his son to repeat the word. The narrator refused. His dad asked again and again, until eventually the narrator gave up and said, "Twink, Dad, twink." And his dad immediately snapped his fingers like he had just remembered the answer to a trivia question. "No, not in front of the random girl, too. Please just let this man watch his movie." The dad then quickly clarified to the woman that despite sitting together in the theater's couple seat, they were in fact not twinking, at which point the narrator finally interrupted the conversation, reminded his dad that they were probably bothering this poor woman, and Dad apologized and left her alone. The narrator assumed the worst was finally over, and for the most part, it was. They sat down, the movie started, and things became relatively normal again. Until, at some point during the film, the dad leaned over and quietly asked another question. He wanted to know, if a father put his arm around his son while they were sitting together in the love seat, would that count as twinking? Oh my God, he was still thinking about it. The narrator told him he was still using the word incorrectly, but he also admitted that he was completely fine with his dad putting an arm around his shoulder. So despite being horrifically embarrassed by pretty much everything leading up to it, the two of them ended up watching the movie together exactly as they had planned. Looking back, the narrator says the whole thing was definitely awkward, but compared with some of the truly disastrous stories people post online, it wasn't exactly the worst thing that could have happened. It was mostly just one extremely embarrassing father-son trip to the movies, with several moments he wishes he could erase from his memory. And I found one comment underneath that I think summarizes this entire story perfectly. Sounds like your dad enjoyed the time together while you were busy worrying about your impression on strangers. Yeah, I think that's exactly what happened. As for me, I actually really like this one. The narrator spent the entire time thinking about how everything looked to strangers, while his dad was just completely unbothered and happy to be hanging out with his son. Was Dad making the situation approximately 1,000 times more embarrassing than necessary? Absolutely. But I don't think there was anything mean behind it. He just found the whole situation funny, and unfortunately discovered that embarrassing his son made it even funnier. And then asking during the movie if putting his arm around him counted as twinking. Nope. At that point, he was absolutely doing it on purpose, but honestly, sitting in a ridiculous love seat with your dad and being embarrassed by him at the movies is probably one of those memories that becomes way funnier 10 years later. So, wholesome ending despite all the secondhand embarrassment. Anyways, I think we'll finish today's stories with one last, very simple piece of petty revenge. Nothing dramatic, nobody's relationship is falling apart. Just one coworker who apparently couldn't stop stealing pens. This one is called My Coworker Kept Stealing My Pens, so I swapped them out. The narrator used to keep a few pens on their desk at work. Nothing special, just regular pens they could grab whenever they needed one. But for some reason, those pens had a habit of disappearing. At first, the narrator assumed they were simply being careless. Maybe they were leaving them in meeting rooms. Maybe somebody borrowed one and forgot to return it. Nothing worth making a big deal about. Eventually, though, they noticed something interesting. One particular coworker always seemed to have the exact same pens the narrator kept buying. And after seeing that happen a few times, it became pretty obvious where at least some of the missing desk supplies were going. You know, stealing one pen by accident is believable. When you somehow keep accidentally acquiring the exact same pens from the same person, that starts looking a little suspicious. The narrator could have just confronted him. Instead, they decided to make things slightly more entertaining. They bought a pack of disappearing ink pens and casually left them sitting on the desk like normal. Then they waited. And sure enough, one of them disappeared. Even better, the coworker apparently took the pen right before going into a meeting. He sat down, started taking notes, and everything seemed completely normal at first. But as the meeting continued, the ink slowly started fading, a little more, and a little more, until eventually an entire page of notes had basically disappeared. The coworker just stared at the paper in complete confusion, while everyone around him continued writing like nothing was wrong. Meanwhile, the narrator was apparently doing everything possible not to start laughing. Imagine watching your own meeting notes slowly erase themselves and having absolutely no idea why. I think I'd start questioning the pen, then the paper, and eventually myself. The narrator never confronted him afterward. They never explained what happened, and apparently never even had to, because after that little incident, the coworker stopped touching the pens on their desk, And according to the narrator, their office supplies have been perfectly safe ever since. Okay, that might be one of the cleanest petty revenge stories we've had today. No argument, no awkward confrontation, just quietly replacing your pens and letting the problem solve itself. And I love that he apparently never figured it out. He just had one mysterious day where his notes vanished in front of him and somehow decided stealing pens wasn't worth the risk anymore. Honestly, fair enough. I'd probably bring my own pens after that too. And that's going to be it for today, my friends. I really hope you enjoyed hanging out with me and listening to these stories. We actually got quite a bit done today too. I finally finished our little house on the lake, and I started a small farm nearby, so this place is slowly starting to feel a lot more like home. I've still got a bunch of ideas for this area, so I'm really excited to keep working on it in the next few episodes. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, leaving a like or subscribing really does mean a lot, and feel free to leave me a comment too. I genuinely love reading what you guys have to say. Thank you for spending a part of your day or night with me. I hope you have a really good rest of your day, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.